Before a single frame of Furious 7 rolled, before Dominic Toretto ever revved an engine on screen for this installment, the film had already become something far bigger than a typical action sequel. It had become a story about loss, about family in the most literal and painful sense, and about how an entire industry pauses to grieve one of its own. To understand Furious 7 is to understand that this is not simply the seventh entry in a street racing franchise that started in 2001 with illegal drag races and stolen DVD players. This is the film where fiction and reality collided in a way that few blockbusters ever experience, and that collision shapes every single decision made behind the camera, in the editing room, and in the marketing campaign that eventually surrounded its release. The production background that changed everything. Furious 7 began its life under the direction of James Wan, a filmmaker best known at the time for horror films like Saw and Insidious, rather than high-octane vehicular action. This was, on paper, an unusual choice. The Fast and Furious franchise by 2014 had transformed into one of the most bankable action series on the planet, largely due to the work of director Justin Lin, who had helmed 4 consecutive entries and essentially reinvented the series from a niche street racing drama into a globe-trotting heist franchise built around gravity-defying vehicular stunts. When Lin departed after Fast and Furious 6, the studio needed someone who could both honor what Lin had built and bring something fresh to the table. James Wan, despite his horror pedigree, had shown in his earlier work a strong command of tension, pacing, and visual composition, qualities that translate surprisingly well into large-scale action filmmaking. This was, in fact, his first major action blockbuster, and the confidence with which he handled the transition speaks to a versatility that many directors attempting a genre leap of this magnitude simply do not possess. The film picks up story threads from Fast and Furious 6, most notably introducing Deckard Shaw, played by Jason Statham, as the vengeful older brother of the previous film's antagonist, Owen Shaw. This narrative connective tissue is important to understand because it reflects how the franchise, by this point, had fully committed to serialized storytelling. Earlier films in the series were largely standalone, connected loosely by character relationships rather than an ongoing plot. Starting around Fast 5, and solidifying through Fast and Furious 6, the films began functioning more like chapters in a continuous saga, with mid-credits and post-credit sequences setting up future conflicts. Deckard Shaw's introduction as a rogue special forces operative seeking revenge for his brother's injuries gave the franchise its most personally motivated villain yet, someone whose vendetta was not about money, drugs, or criminal empires, but about family retribution, a thematic mirror to the protagonist's own worldview. Then, on November 30, 2013, production was upended in the most tragic way imaginable. Paul Walker, who had played Brian O'Connor since the franchise's very first film in 2001, was killed in a single-vehicle crash in Santa Clarita, California. He was a passenger in a Porsche Carrera GT driven by his friend Roger Rodos, and the vehicle struck a light pole and burst into flames. Walker was 30 years old. At the time of his death, filming for Furious 7 was already underway, with a significant portion of Walker's scenes yet to be shot. This is where the story of Furious 7 becomes less about typical Hollywood production logistics and more about an extraordinary act of collective determination. Universal Pictures faced a decision that few studios have ever had to confront: shut down production entirely, recast the role, or find a way to finish the film while honoring the actor who had defined it for over a decade. They chose the third path, and the solution involved Paul Walker's own brothers, Cody Walker and Caleb Walker, stepping in as body doubles for the remaining scenes, combined with visual effects work from Weta Digital, the New Zealand-based effects house famous for its work on The Lord of the Rings and Avatar, to digitally recreate Paul Walker's face and blend it convincingly onto his brothers' performances. This was an unprecedented technical and emotional undertaking. It was not simply a matter of inserting a digital double into a handful of shots. Entire sequences needed to be reworked, dialogue needed to be rewritten to account for scenes that could no longer be filmed as originally planned, and the film's ending needed to be completely reconceived to serve as a genuine farewell rather than a continuation of a storyline that assumed the actor would return for future installments. It's worth pausing here to consider just how difficult this must have been for everyone involved, from Vin Diesel, who had been close friends with Walker since the original film and has spoken publicly about how deeply the loss affected him, to the rest of the cast, many of whom had spent over a decade working alongside Walker and considered the production a genuine second family. James Wan has spoken in interviews about how the shoot became something almost therapeutic, a way for the cast and crew to process their grief while simultaneously creating something that would honor their friend's legacy. This is not simply marketing language. production delays of nearly a year, technical innovations in facial recreation technology, and the emotional toll on everyone involved all point to a filmmaking process that was fundamentally shaped by tragedy in a way that very few blockbuster productions have ever experienced. Why this context matters for understanding the film itself. Some viewers who watch Furious 7 without knowing this background might simply see a fun, over-the-top action movie with cars parachuting out of airplanes and driving between skyscrapers in Abu Dhabi. And on one level, that reading is entirely valid, because the film absolutely delivers on that front. But knowing the circumstances under which it was made recontextualizes nearly every scene involving Brian O'Connor. There's a heaviness to his domestic scenes with his young family, an underlying sense of finality to his interactions with Dominic Toretto, that becomes almost unbearably poignant once you understand that the filmmakers were, in real time, saying goodbye to their friend and colleague through the language of cinema. This is a critical distinction to make for anyone analyzing the film seriously. The emotional weight of Furious 7 is not purely a scripted narrative device. It exists at the intersection of fiction and documentary truth, in the sense that the actors' grief was genuine, and that grief bleeds into their performances whether intentionally or not. When Vin Diesel delivers Dominic Toretto's final lines to Brian in the film's closing moments, audiences are not just watching two fictional characters part ways. They are watching Vin Diesel say goodbye to Paul Walker, filtered through the fictional frame of their characters. This blurring of actor and character, of real loss and scripted farewell, is one of the reasons Furious 7 resonated so powerfully with audiences upon release, generating an emotional response that arguably exceeded anything else in the franchise's history, before or since. It's also worth noting, for the sake of clear-eyed analysis rather than pure sentimentality, that this circumstance created genuine production challenges that some critics have pointed to when discussing the film's narrative construction. Certain plot elements feel slightly compressed or rushed, likely a result of having to rework the script around the limitations imposed by Walker's absence. The film's structure, which involves Brian O'Connor being kept somewhat separate from certain group action sequences compared to his role in earlier films, is a direct consequence of the production needing to limit the scenes requiring the complex digital double work. This is not a criticism meant to diminish the achievement, but rather an observation that helps explain certain choices viewers might notice on repeat viewings, where Brian seems to operate slightly on the periphery of some of the larger set pieces compared to his more central involvement in previous entries. The broader industry significance. Beyond its impact on the immediate cast and crew, the circumstances surrounding Furious 7's production also raised broader questions within the film industry about how studios handle unexpected tragedies during production, and about the ethics and technical possibilities of digital recreation of actors. The wetter digital work on this film became a frequently cited case study in subsequent years whenever discussions arose about digital actors, deepfake technology, and the use of computer-generated recreations of real performers, whether living or deceased. It predates, but in some ways foreshadows, later industry conversations about digital likeness rights that would become increasingly prominent, particularly during labor disputes involving actors' unions concerned about the unauthorized or exploitative use of digital recreations of performers. There's also a commercial dimension worth understanding. The tragedy, combined with the genuine emotional send-off crafted for Brian O'Connor's character, contributed to Furious 7 becoming an enormous box office success, eventually grossing over $1.5 billion worldwide, a figure that placed it among the highest-grossing films of all time at the point of its release. While it would be reductive and somewhat cynical to suggest that the film's box office performance was driven purely by public curiosity or sympathy related to Walker's death, it's fair to say that the film's marketing, and the cultural conversation surrounding its release, was inseparable from the real-world story behind it. Audiences went to theaters not just to see another action sequel, but to participate in a collective farewell, and the film industry took note of just how powerfully that kind of authentic emotional stakes could resonate commercially, a lesson that arguably influenced how the franchise, and Hollywood blockbusters more broadly, would approach character send-offs and franchise transitions in the years that followed. Understanding this production background is essential before diving into any other aspect of Furious 7, whether that's the film's action choreography, its narrative structure, its villain, or its place within the broader Fast and Furious saga. Every subsequent point of analysis is colored by the knowledge that this film was made under the shadow of real loss, transformed by its cast and crew into something that functions simultaneously as a summer action blockbuster and as a deeply personal, publicly shared act of mourning. Let me know which key point you'd like next: the villain and Jason Statham's role, the action set pieces and stunt work, the emotional farewell and ending, box office and critical. Every great action franchise is defined, at least in part, by the quality of its villains, and Furious 7 introduces one of the most memorable antagonists in the series' history, Deckard Shaw, played by Jason Statham. To understand why this character works so effectively, and why his introduction represents a meaningful evolution in how the franchise approaches conflict, it helps to look at the broader pattern of villains across the Fast and Furious saga up to this point, and then examine exactly what Statham's performance and the writing around his character do differently. The franchise's villain problem before Furious 7. In the earlier Fast and Furious films, antagonists tended to be defined primarily by their criminal enterprises rather than by personal vendettas against the core cast. The original film's Johnny Tran was a rival street racer entangled in a drug smuggling operation. Carter Verone in Too Fast Too Furious was a drug lord. Arturo Braga in Fast and Furious was a cartel boss. Even Owen Shaw, the antagonist of Fast and Furious 6 and Deckard's younger brother, was fundamentally a mercenary criminal, a former British Special Forces officer turned high-tech thief pursuing a valuable piece of technology, with his conflict against Dominic Toretto's crew arising from circumstance rather than deep-seated personal hatred. These villains were often effective in the context of their individual films, giving Dom's team an obstacle to overcome through heists, races, or physical confrontation, but they rarely carried emotional weight beyond the immediate plot. Once defeated, they were narratively closed chapters. Deckard Shaw breaks this mold entirely. His motivation is not criminal enterprise, financial gain, or professional rivalry. It is, quite simply, revenge for his brother. When Owen Shaw is left in a coma at the end of Fast and Furious 6 after his final confrontation with Dom's crew, Deckard emerges as a figure whose entire arc in Furious 7 is driven by a desire to make Dominic Toretto's family suffer the same way his own family suffered. This is a crucial shift because it means Deckard Shaw is not simply an obstacle standing between the heroes and a MacGuffin. He is a mirror. He operates according to the exact same code of loyalty and vengeance that defines Dominic Toretto himself. Both men would burn the world down to protect or avenge their family. The difference is which side of that equation they occupy in this particular story. This thematic symmetry is what elevates Deckard Shaw above being a generic action movie heavy, and it's a detail that rewards viewers who think carefully about how the franchise constructs its conflicts rather than watching passively. Jason Statham's casting and what he brings to the role. Jason Statham was, by 2015, already one of the most established action stars in the industry, having built his career through films like the Transporter series, Crank, The Bank Job, and Snatch. His casting in the Fast and Furious franchise is notable for a few reasons. First, it represented the series bringing in an actor with genuine action hero credibility and a distinct physical presence, someone whose fighting style and screen persona were already well established with audiences before he ever appeared on screen as Deckard Shaw. This matters because part of what makes an antagonist credible in an ensemble action franchise is the audience's pre-existing sense that this person could plausibly threaten characters we've watched dominate increasingly outrageous set pieces across 6 previous films. Statham's reputation does a significant amount of narrative heavy lifting before he even speaks a line of dialogue. Second, Statham's performance style, built around controlled intensity, dry wit, and a kind of coiled physical menace, provides a tonal contrast to the ensemble's more boisterous, family-oriented energy. Where Dom's crew often communicates through warmth, humor, and loud camaraderie, Statham plays Shaw with a clipped, precise, almost surgical quality. His fight scenes reflect this. Rather than relying purely on the more chaotic, brawling style seen in some earlier franchise fights, Shaw's confrontations, particularly his early hallway fight against Dwayne Johnson's character Luke Hobbs, showcase a mixed martial arts and stunt choreography approach that draws on Statham's real background in physical performance. That opening confrontation between Shaw and Hobbs is frequently cited by fans and critics alike as one of the standout physical sequences in the film, not simply for its scale but for its brutality and precision, giving audiences an early, visceral sense that this villain operates on a different level than what the series has shown before. How Deckard Shaw's introduction structures the film. From a screenwriting perspective, the way Chris Morgan, the film's writer, introduces Deckard Shaw is worth examining closely. The film opens with Shaw walking through the aftermath of his attack on Hobbs's DSS office, calmly surveying the destruction he has caused, before we cut to him standing over his brother Owen's hospital bed, delivering a quiet, controlled promise of retribution. This opening sequence accomplishes several things simultaneously. It establishes Shaw's competence and danger before he has interacted with any of the film's protagonists, meaning audiences understand the threat level before Dom's crew does. It also grounds his motivation immediately and unambiguously, which is important because a villain whose motivations are murky or unclear often fails to generate the same emotional stakes as one whose goals are crystal clear from the outset. There is no ambiguity about what Deckard Shaw wants or why he wants it, and that clarity allows the film to spend its runtime on escalating confrontations rather than expository unpacking of the villain's psychology. Throughout the film, Shaw operates as a kind of roving threat, appearing unpredictably to attack members of Dom's extended family, including a tense and memorable sequence in which he targets Hobbs directly, seriously injuring him and effectively removing Dwayne Johnson's character from a significant portion of the middle act. This structural choice, of having the villain systematically pick off or neutralize members of the ensemble cast, creates a persistent sense of dread that runs beneath the film's more spectacle-driven set pieces. Even when the characters are engaged in the film's more outlandish action sequences, like the car parachuting sequence in the Caucasus Mountains, there's an underlying awareness that Shaw is still out there, still hunting them, which helps sustain tension across a runtime that otherwise risks feeling like a series of disconnected action vignettes strung together by a thin plot involving a hacking device called the God's Eye. The thematic function of Shaw as a dark reflection. One of the more interesting critical readings of Deckard Shaw's role in Furious 7 involves viewing him as a distorted reflection of what Dominic Toretto's philosophy could become if stripped of its more communal, chosen family warmth. Dom's mantra throughout the franchise, repeated in various forms across multiple films, centers on the idea that family is not necessarily about blood, but about loyalty, sacrifice, and shared bonds forged through shared experience. Deckard Shaw, by contrast, represents family loyalty in its most narrow, blood relation sense, a version of the same core value that curdles into something purely destructive because it lacks the broader communal ethic that defines Dom's crew. Where Dom's family expands to include former enemies, government agents, and outsiders who prove their loyalty, Shaw's sense of family begins and ends with his brother, and his quest for vengeance shows no capacity for the kind of redemption or reconciliation that the franchise typically extends to its antagonists. This is worth noting because the Fast and Furious franchise has a well-established pattern of transforming its villains into future allies. Han, Giselle, Hobbs, and even eventually Deckard Shaw himself in later films, all begin as adversaries before being folded into the extended family that the series celebrates. Shaw's eventual redemption arc, which unfolds gradually across the fate of the Furious and subsequent films, actually begins to take shape by the end of Furious 7, in a sequence where circumstances force an uneasy, temporary alliance between Shaw and Dom's crew against a common enemy, the mercenary Jacand, played by Djimon Hounsou. This is a clever narrative device because it allows the film to preview the franchise's eventual softening of Shaw's character without fully resolving his conflict with Dom within this particular installment, leaving thematic and narrative threads open for future films while still delivering a satisfying confrontation within Furious 7 itself. Critical and audience reception of the character. Critics generally responded favorably to Statham's performance and to the character of Deckard Shaw as a franchise antagonist, with many reviewers specifically praising the physicality and intensity he brought to the role, as well as the way his rivalry with Dwayne Johnson's Hobbs added a compelling new dynamic to the ensemble. Some critics did note that Shaw's motivations, while clear, remained somewhat thin on a purely narrative level, functioning more as a vehicle for escalating action set pieces than as a fully three-dimensional character in his own right within this specific film. This is a fair critical observation. Furious 7 does not spend significant time exploring Shaw's inner life beyond his relationship with his brother, and viewers looking for the kind of nuanced villain writing found in more character-driven dramas may find him comparatively straightforward. However, within the context of what this film is trying to accomplish, a high-octane action spectacle balancing multiple ongoing storylines and an emotionally weighted farewell to Paul Walker's character, Shaw's relative narrative simplicity can also be read as an intentional and effective choice, ensuring the character serves his function without pulling focus away from the film's central emotional through line. Audience reception, meanwhile, was overwhelmingly positive, and Deckard Shaw quickly became a fan-favorite character, popular enough that Statham was brought back for a substantially larger, redemption-focused role in subsequent films, eventually leading to his own spin-off feature, Hobbs and Shaw, released in 2019, which paired Statham's character with Dwayne Johnson's Hobbs in a buddy action format that leaned heavily into the chemistry and rivalry the two actors first established during their confrontations in Furious 7. This spin-off represents a significant commercial validation of how well audiences responded to the character, and it's worth noting as a piece of franchise trivia that the animosity-turned alliance between Hobbs and Shaw, first sparked in this film, ultimately became substantial enough to support an entire standalone feature film, a testament to how effectively the writing, performances, and action choreography in Furious 7 established this particular rivalry. Taken as a whole, Deckard Shaw represents a meaningful step forward in how the Fast and Furious franchise constructs its antagonists, introducing a villain whose personal stakes, physical credibility, and thematic resonance with the series' core values about family elevate him above the more generic criminal masterminds of earlier installments. His introduction in Furious 7 set a template that the franchise would continue to draw from in subsequent films, proving that a well-constructed personal vendetta, backed by a committed physical performance, can generate more sustained tension across a film's runtime than a simple heist-based conflict ever could. Let me know which key point you'd like next: the action set pieces and stunt choreography, the emotional farewell and ending for Brian O'Connor, box office performance and critical reception, or the film's legacy within the franchise. And I'll go if Deckard Shaw represented the franchise's evolution in villain writing. The action sequences in Furious 7 represent something arguably even more significant: a full-blown recalibration of what audiences should expect from big-budget vehicular action cinema. By 2015, the Fast and Furious series had already built a reputation for escalating absurdity, moving from street races and hijacked trucks to tanks, submarines, and cars leaping between buildings. Furious 7 took that trajectory and pushed it further than any prior installment, delivering set pieces so audacious that they became instantly iconic, while also sparking genuine debate among critics and audiences about where the line between thrilling spectacle and diminishing narrative plausibility actually sits. Examining these sequences from multiple angles, technical craftsmanship, narrative function, critical reception, and cultural impact, reveals just how much this film reshaped expectations for the genre going forward. The car parachuting sequence, a case study in practical ambition. Perhaps no single sequence better encapsulates the film's approach to action than the now famous moment in which Dom's crew parachutes their cars out of a cargo plane into the mountains of Azerbaijan, in order to intercept a heavily armed convoy transporting a hostage and a piece of hacking technology. What makes this sequence worth analyzing in depth is not simply its visual spectacle, though that spectacle is considerable, but the layered production reality behind it. James Wan and his stunt team, led by veteran stunt coordinator Jack Gill, insisted on using genuine practical stunt work wherever feasible, employing real parachute riggings on actual vehicles dropped from real aircraft, combined selectively with visual effects to enhance and stabilize shots that would have been too dangerous or logistically impossible to capture otherwise. This hybrid approach, blending practical stunts with digital augmentation rather than relying purely on computer-generated imagery, is a meaningful point of distinction that separates Furious 7 from many of its blockbuster contemporaries. From a technical craftsmanship perspective, this sequence deserves genuine praise. The sense of weight and physicality in the vehicles as they tumble through the air, the way the cars bounce and skid upon landing, carries a tactile quality that purely CGI-rendered sequences often struggle to replicate convincingly. Critics at the time frequently singled this scene out as a highlight, praising its audacity and the technical skill required to pull it off. From a narrative function standpoint, the sequence also does important structural work, immediately establishing the film's shift into globe-trotting, mission-style storytelling, echoing the heist film sensibilities that Justin Lin had introduced in earlier entries while pushing the stakes and scale even further. However, viewed from a more skeptical critical lens, this sequence also represents the point at which some longtime fans and critics began questioning whether the franchise had fully abandoned any pretense of grounded realism. Earlier films, even at their most exaggerated, maintained some tether to plausible physics, cars performing feats that were extreme but at least conceptually rooted in real-world vehicular capability. The parachuting sequence, by contrast, asks audiences to accept a level of coordinated precision, cars landing on a narrow mountain road while under fire, drivers immediately regaining full control upon touchdown, that stretches believability considerably. This is not necessarily a weakness in isolation. The franchise had already been moving in this heightened direction for several films, and audiences largely embraced the escalation as part of the series' evolving identity. But it's worth noting as a legitimate point of critical debate, because it foreshadows an ongoing tension within the franchise's later films about how far the action can be pushed before it fundamentally changes the nature of what these movies are. The Etihad Tower sequence, precision, spectacle, and international scale. Another standout set piece involves a sports car being driven through, and eventually out of, one of the Etihad Tower skyscrapers in Abu Dhabi, crashing through multiple buildings in a sequence that became one of the most heavily marketed moments in the film's promotional campaign. This sequence is worth analyzing both for its visual audacity and for what it represents in terms of the franchise's increasingly international scope. By this point in the series, the story had moved well beyond its Los Angeles street racing origins, incorporating locations across multiple continents as part of its heist thriller structure. The Abu Dhabi sequence, filmed with cooperation from local authorities and showcasing genuinely striking real-world architecture, reflects the franchise's growing ambitions as a global blockbuster property, one increasingly designed with international box office performance in mind, given that overseas markets, particularly in Asia, had become enormously important to the franchise's financial success by this point. From a pure craft perspective, this sequence benefits from strong visual composition, using the genuinely striking silhouette of the Etihad Towers to create a sense of scale and grandeur that grounds the scene's absurdity in a recognizable, visually impressive real-world setting. The choreography of the car crashing through successive buildings, gaining momentum and altitude with each impact, is edited with a clear sense of escalating momentum, building toward a satisfying visual climax. Critically, this sequence tends to be viewed favorably, with many reviewers highlighting it as one of the film's most purely enjoyable moments of big-screen spectacle, precisely because it embraces its own absurdity with confidence rather than attempting to justify itself through labored exposition. That said, some critical perspectives raise a fair point about diminishing returns. Once a franchise has already shown cars parachuting from airplanes, subsequent set pieces face an inherent challenge in continuing to escalate stakes and spectacle without the audience becoming desensitized. The Etihad Tower sequence works largely because of its visual novelty and international setting rather than because it raises the emotional or narrative stakes established earlier in the film. This is a pattern worth noting for viewers analyzing the franchise's broader trajectory. Action set pieces in the Fast and Furious series increasingly function as standalone spectacle moments, memorable and shareable in isolation, sometimes at the expense of tighter integration with the film's emotional or narrative core. The Los Angeles finale, grounding the spectacle in character stakes. In contrast to the globetrotting, larger-than-life set pieces earlier in the film, Furious 7's climactic battle takes place back in Los Angeles, as Dom's crew defends their home turf against Deckard Shaw and the mercenary Jacand, who arrives with a helicopter gunship and small army of vehicles. This shift back to a familiar, grounded location is a deliberate structural choice, and it's worth examining why it works so effectively as a finale despite following sequences of even greater visual scale. The Los Angeles finale succeeds because it reintroduces genuine stakes tied directly to the character's emotional world rather than relying purely on scale for its impact. The crew is not fighting to protect an abstract MacGuffin or complete a mission in a foreign country. They are defending their own neighborhood, their own home turf, essentially the symbolic heart of the family unit that the franchise has spent 7 films building. This allows the sequence to combine large-scale action, including extended vehicular combat and a genuinely tense confrontation between Dom and Shaw, with a sense of intimacy and personal investment that the more spectacle-driven international sequences, however impressive, do not always achieve. Structurally, this reflects smart screenwriting, using geography and setting to mirror the emotional arc of the story, moving from expansive, unfamiliar spectacle toward a climax rooted in home, family, and personal reckoning. From a critical perspective, this sequence has generally been well received specifically because of this balance. Reviewers noted that despite the outlandish nature of a fully armed drone and gunship assault on a residential street, the emotional grounding of the characters fighting to protect their home gives the action a sense of purpose that some of the film's earlier, more disconnected set pieces lack. It's a useful demonstration of a broader principle in action filmmaking. Scale alone does not generate emotional investment, but scale combined with clear personal stakes can produce genuinely compelling cinema. Even when the underlying premise remains inherently far-fetched, the stunt work behind the camera, craft, danger, and industry recognition. It's worth dedicating attention specifically to the stunt performers and coordinators whose work makes these sequences possible, since their contributions are often underappreciated in mainstream film criticism despite being central to what makes the Fast and Furious franchise function as a viewing experience. Furious 7's production employed an extensive team of stunt drivers, riggers, and coordinators, working under genuinely hazardous conditions to execute sequences involving high-speed driving, controlled car crashes, aerial stunts, and precision choreography. The film's production has been cited within the industry as an example of the scale and risk involved in modern practical stunt work, and it contributed to ongoing conversations within Hollywood about stunt performer recognition, given that, at the time, there was no dedicated Academy Award category honoring stunt coordination and stunt performance, an omission that stunt professionals and their advocates have long argued undervalues the physical risk and technical skill required to produce sequences of this caliber. This is a meaningful point of significance beyond the film itself. Furious 7, alongside other action-heavy productions of the era, became part of a broader industry conversation about how stunt work is credited, compensated, and recognized within the film industry's awards infrastructure. While this conversation extends well beyond any single film, Furious 7's scale and ambition made it a frequently cited example when discussing just how much genuinely dangerous, highly skilled physical work goes into producing modern action blockbusters, work that often goes unacknowledged by mainstream awards bodies even as it forms the technical backbone of some of the highest-grossing films ever made. Weighing the overall impact, spectacle versus substance. Taken together, the action sequences in Furious 7 represent both the franchise's greatest strength and its most persistent point of critical tension. On one hand, these set pieces are executed with genuine technical skill, ambitious practical stunt work, and a level of visual imagination that few other action franchises can match, and they contributed directly to the film's massive commercial success. On the other hand, the increasing scale and audacity of these sequences raise legitimate questions, echoed by numerous critics at the time, about whether the franchise's commitment to ever-escalating spectacle risks overshadowing character development and narrative coherence. Ultimately, most critical and audience consensus lands on a favorable view of the action in Furious 7 specifically because the film manages to balance its most outlandish sequences with a genuine emotional through line, particularly given the real-world context surrounding Paul Walker's death. The action never entirely loses sight of the characters at its center, even as the stunts themselves push further into blockbuster fantasy than any prior installment. This balance, spectacle in service of, rather than in place of, character and emotional stakes, is arguably the defining achievement of Furious 7's approach to action filmmaking, and it set a benchmark that subsequent entries in the franchise would continue to chase, not always with equal success. If the previous sections explored the production tragedy behind the film and the technical achievements of its villain and action sequences, this section turns to what many consider the true emotional core of Furious 7, its ending. No discussion of this film is complete without examining how it handles the farewell to Brian O'Connor, Paul Walker's character, because this sequence is widely regarded, by critics, audiences, and the filmmakers themselves, as one of the most genuinely moving moments in modern blockbuster cinema. Understanding why it works so effectively requires looking at its narrative construction, its execution, its emotional impact on audiences, and its broader contribution to how the film functions as both entertainment and tribute. The narrative challenge of writing an ending under these circumstances. To appreciate what the filmmakers accomplished, it helps to first understand the scale of the challenge they faced. When Paul Walker died partway through production, the film's existing script, and indeed the franchise's broader long-term plans, had to be fundamentally reconsidered. Brian O'Connor had been a central figure in the series since its inception, an undercover cop-turned-outlaw racer whose journey from law enforcement to found family had formed one of the emotional backbones of the entire saga. The original narrative direction presumably intended for Brian to continue as an active participant in future installments, given that prior to Walker's death there was no indication the character was being written toward departure. With Walker gone, the filmmakers, including director James Wan, writer Chris Morgan, and the studio, faced a decision that required enormous sensitivity. They could not simply write Brian out of the story through an off-screen death or a narrative shortcut, given how emotionally significant the character was to longtime fans, and doing so would have felt jarring and potentially exploitative given the real tragedy involved. At the same time, continuing to feature Brian as a fully active character in future storylines was not a viable path forward, since there was no way to keep making films with Brian O'Connor without the involvement of the actor who defined him. The solution the filmmakers arrived at was to give the character a proper send-off within Furious 7 itself, using the film's ending to gracefully transition Brian out of the ongoing storyline while treating. This required threading an extremely delicate needle. The ending needed to function within the fictional world of the story, giving Brian a send-off that made sense for his character's journey, retiring from the dangerous life of heists and high-speed chases to focus on raising his family with Mia, his wife, played by Jordana Brewster. But it also needed to function as an unmistakable, heartfelt tribute to Paul Walker himself, acknowledging to audiences, many of whom were watching the film specifically aware of what had happened, that this was genuinely goodbye. Achieving both of these goals simultaneously, without one undermining the other, is an impressive feat of screenwriting and directorial restraint, particularly given the emotionally fraught circumstances under which the film was completed. How the sequence is constructed and executed. The film's final scenes unfold with a noticeably different rhythm compared to the rest of the movie. After the frenetic, high-stakes action of the Los Angeles finale, the film slows down considerably, shifting into a more reflective, elegiac tone. Dominic Toretto, having just helped defeat Deckard Shaw and Jacan's forces alongside his crew, finds himself reflecting on the road ahead, both literally and figuratively. The sequence that follows involves Dom encountering Brian on a road, the two men essentially reaching a fork where their paths diverge, Brian heading toward his family and a quieter life, Dom continuing forward, presumably toward whatever adventures still await him and the rest of the crew. Visually, this sequence is constructed with deliberate simplicity. Rather than closing the film with another elaborate action set piece or a chaotic, spectacle-driven climax, the filmmakers chose restraint, allowing the emotional weight of the farewell to breathe without competing for attention against explosions or vehicular mayhem. This is a notable directorial choice from James Wan, whose horror background arguably serves him well here, since horror filmmaking often relies heavily on the power of stillness, silence, and suggestion rather than constant visual noise, skills that translate effectively into crafting a quiet, contemplative farewell scene rather than overplaying the emotion with excessive sentimentality. The sequence is also notable for its use of visual symbolism. Without reproducing specific dialogue, it's fair to describe the general shape of the scene. The two characters reflect briefly on their shared history, on the family they've built together across the course of the franchise, before their paths visually and literally split, with the editing and cinematography emphasizing the sense of two roads diverging. A fairly clear visual metaphor that most audiences intuitively understood as representing the character's departure from the ongoing story. This is intercut with a montage revisiting quick, warm flashes of earlier moments from across the franchise's history, essentially allowing the film to briefly step outside its own narrative to directly acknowledge the audience's real emotional relationship with these characters across 14 years of films. Musically, the sequence is anchored by the song See You Again, performed by Wiz Khalifa featuring Charlie Puth, which was written specifically for this moment in the film. The song's lyrics, without reproducing them directly, deal explicitly with themes of loss, memory, and moving forward while still carrying someone's memory with you, themes that map directly onto both the fictional farewell between Dom and Brian and the real-world tribute to Paul Walker. This musical choice deserves specific analytical attention because of just how significant its impact became independent of the film itself. See You Again went on to become an enormous commercial success, topping music charts in multiple countries and becoming one of the best-selling digital singles of all time, eventually amassing billions of views on streaming platforms. This is a rare case of a film's closing needle drop transcending the movie entirely to become a standalone cultural phenomenon, one closely associated with grief, tribute, and remembrance well beyond the context of the Fast and Furious franchise itself. Audience impact and emotional reception. The impact of this ending on audiences upon the film's theatrical release in April 2015 was, by most accounts, extraordinary. Numerous contemporary reports and widely shared accounts described audible emotional reactions in theaters worldwide, audiences applauding, crying, and in some cases standing in tribute as the final scene played out. This is worth analyzing not simply as an anecdotal curiosity but as a genuine indicator of how effectively the filmmakers achieved their goal. Blockbuster action films are not typically associated with this kind of raw, communal emotional response. They are generally consumed as entertainment first, with emotional engagement being a secondary, if welcome, byproduct. Furious 7's ending achieved something closer to the kind of collective catharsis usually associated with prestige dramas or documentaries dealing directly with grief and loss, a testament to how successfully the film blended its fictional farewell with the audience's real awareness of Paul Walker's death. It's worth noting, from an analytical standpoint, that this emotional power derives from a fairly unique convergence of factors that would be difficult, if not impossible, to replicate deliberately. The audience's emotional response was not purely a product of skilled filmmaking in isolation, it was inseparable from the real-world knowledge that this was, in fact, a genuine goodbye to an actor whom many viewers had grown up watching since the year 2001. This raises an interesting point of media analysis regarding the relationship between fiction and audience knowledge of real-world context. The same scene, stripped of the audience's awareness of Walker's death, would likely still be an effective, well-crafted farewell sequence, but it would not carry nearly the same emotional weight. This is a clear example of how paratextual knowledge, meaning information audiences bring to a film from outside the text itself, can fundamentally shape and amplify the emotional experience of watching that film. Critical reception of the ending. Critics were broadly positive regarding how the film handled this incredibly difficult creative and emotional challenge. Many reviewers specifically praised the restraint shown in the final sequence, noting that the filmmakers avoided the trap of excessive sentimentality or manipulative emotional signaling that might have felt exploitative given the real tragedy involved. Instead, the general critical consensus held that the ending struck a respectful, heartfelt balance, treating the moment with the gravity it deserved without overstaying its welcome or milking the emotion for more than it could bear. Some critics did raise a more complicated point worth including in any thorough analysis. the question of whether a mainstream commercial franchise film is an appropriate vehicle for processing genuine, real-world grief at all. This is a legitimate critical perspective, and it's an area where interpretation reasonably varies. Some viewers and critics found something slightly uncomfortable about a major studio blockbuster, ultimately a commercial product designed to generate box office revenue, serving as the primary public platform for mourning a real person's death. Others countered that this discomfort, while understandable, overlooks the fact that the cast and crew's grief was entirely genuine, and that the film gave them, and by extension the audience who had followed these characters for over a decade, a meaningful, sincere outlet for collective mourning that might not have existed otherwise. This is ultimately a matter of subjective interpretation rather than objective critical consensus, and thoughtful analysis of the film should acknowledge both perspectives rather than presenting one as definitively correct. The ending's broader contribution to the film and franchise. Beyond its immediate emotional impact, this ending serves several important structural and thematic functions within Furious 7 and the franchise as a whole. Narratively, it provides a clean, respectful resolution to Brian O'Connor's arc, transitioning him out of active storylines in a way that feels earned rather than abrupt, allowing future films to reference his character as having retired to a peaceful family life rather than requiring any further explanation. Thematically, it reinforces the franchise's central, oft-repeated philosophy about family, loyalty, and the choice to prioritize the people you love over the adrenaline-fueled lifestyle that defined the earlier films, giving that theme its most powerful and genuine demonstration across the entire saga. From a franchise legacy perspective, this ending also fundamentally altered how audiences and critics discuss Furious 7 relative to the rest of the series. Even years later, this film is frequently cited, discussed, and referenced specifically because of how it handled this farewell, often ranking among the most emotionally affecting moments in modern action cinema more broadly, not just within its own franchise. It elevated Furious 7 beyond being simply another entry in a long-running action series, transforming it into a genuine cultural touchstone, a film people return to and discuss specifically because of how effectively, and how respectfully, it handled an almost impossible emotional and creative challenge. Every film ultimately gets measured, at least in part, by how it performs commercially and how critics receive it, but Furious 7 presents a particularly fascinating case study because its box office numbers and critical reception cannot be separated from the emotional context surrounding its release. This section takes a close look at the film's financial performance, the records it broke, how critics assessed it both as a standalone film and as an emotional tribute, and what all of this tells us about the relationship between audience sentiment, real-world events, and commercial cinema. Breaking records from opening night. Furious 7 opened in theaters on April 3, 2015, and its box office debut was immediately historic. The film's opening weekend generated $147.1 million domestically, a figure that represented the biggest opening weekend of all the Fast and Furious franchise films, surpassing Fast and Furious 6's opening of roughly $97.3 million by approximately 43%. This was not simply an incremental improvement over previous installments, it was a substantial leap that signaled just how significantly public anticipation for this film had grown, driven both by the franchise's steadily increasing popularity and by the widespread public awareness of the emotional stakes surrounding Paul Walker's final performance. The domestic opening also set records for the widest release both for the studio and for IMAX screenings at the time, with the film debuting in over 4,000 theaters domestically and hundreds of IMAX locations worldwide. Deadline. Globally, the opening weekend numbers were even more staggering. The film's worldwide opening weekend tallied approximately $392.2 million, a figure that placed it among the largest global openings in film history up to that point. This kind of immediate, overwhelming international response reflects the franchise's status by 2015 as a genuinely global cinematic property, with strong box office performance not just in North America but across Europe, Latin America, and particularly Asia, markets that had become increasingly central to the Fast and Furious franchise's financial model in the years leading up to this release. Deadline. What makes Furious 7's box office trajectory particularly remarkable, though, is not just its opening but the speed at which it continued to accumulate revenue in the weeks that followed. The film crossed $1 billion at the worldwide box office in just 17 days, making it the fastest movie ever to reach that milestone at the time, surpassing the previous pace set by films like The Avengers, Avatar, and the final Harry Potter installment, each of which had taken 19 days to reach the same benchmark. This is a genuinely significant achievement worth pausing on, because reaching $1 billion in worldwide box office revenue is already a rare feat reserved for only the most successful films in cinema history, and doing so faster than any film before it demonstrates just how intensely and immediately global audiences responded to this particular release. Variety. Much of this acceleration was fueled by an especially strong showing in China, a market that by 2015 had become enormously important to Hollywood's biggest blockbusters. The film earned an estimated $68.6 million in a single day upon its Chinese premiere, contributing significantly to an international weekend haul that helped push the film past the $800 million mark in worldwide earnings within just its first 2 weeks of release. This Chinese box office performance is worth noting as a broader industry data point as well, since it reflects the growing importance of Chinese audiences to Hollywood's blockbuster economics during this era, a trend that would continue to shape how major studios approached international marketing and release strategies for their biggest franchise films in the years that followed. Fox News. By the end of its theatrical run, Furious 7 had accumulated a worldwide gross of approximately $1.516 billion, with roughly $353 million coming from domestic North American box office and the remainder, over $1.1 billion, coming from international markets. This made it, at the time of its release, the fourth highest-grossing film in cinema history, and it remains the highest-grossing installment in the Fast and Furious franchise even years later, despite subsequent films continuing to expand the series' scope and scale. Set against a production budget reported at approximately $190 million, the film's financial return represents an extraordinarily successful commercial outcome by any standard measure used within the film industry, interpreting the numbers, commercial success or something more complex. From a purely analytical standpoint, it's worth examining what these box office numbers actually represent, and here is where critical opinion and interpretation genuinely diverge in interesting ways. On a straightforward level, these figures simply reflect a hugely popular franchise entry released at the right time, benefiting from over a decade of built-up audience goodwill, an increasingly effective global marketing and distribution strategy, and the kind of spectacle-driven action that reliably draws large audiences to theaters. Viewed through this lens, Furious 7's box office success is simply the natural culmination of a franchise that had been steadily building momentum since Fast 5 reinvented the series in 2011. However, many industry analysts and critics at the time also pointed to the emotional resonance surrounding Paul Walker's death as a meaningful contributing factor to the film's extraordinary opening numbers and sustained box office momentum. This is admittedly a more speculative interpretation, since it's inherently difficult to isolate exactly how much of a film's box office performance can be attributed to any single factor. It would be an overstatement to suggest that curiosity or sympathy alone drove audiences to theaters in these numbers. The franchise's existing popularity, quality action filmmaking, and effective marketing all played substantial, measurable roles. But it's a reasonable interpretation, rather than a confirmed fact, that public awareness of the tragedy surrounding the production added an additional layer of motivation for many viewers, particularly casual or lapsed fans of the franchise who might not have otherwise prioritized seeing this specific installment in theaters, to experience the film as a form of collective farewell. This interpretation is somewhat supported by anecdotal reporting from the period, including widespread media coverage of emotional audience reactions during theatrical screenings, and by comments from cast members themselves. Jordana Brewster, who plays Mia Toretto, spoke publicly around the film's release about how the movie's themes extended beyond pure action to explore ideas of family, a framing that several cast members used repeatedly in press interviews to contextualize the film's emotional stakes for audiences who might have approached it expecting a purely escapist action experience. This kind of press messaging, while certainly serving a promotional function, also reflects a genuine effort by the people involved in the production to prepare audiences for the film's unusually personal emotional weight. Fox News. Critical reception, balancing spectacle and sentiment. Professional film critics responded to Furious 7 with a notably positive, though not universally uncritical, reception. The film held a strong approval rating among critics on aggregation platforms like Rotten Tomatoes at the time of its release, with many reviewers praising the film's ability to deliver satisfying, large-scale action entertainment while simultaneously handling its emotionally fraught circumstances with genuine sensitivity and craft. This dual achievement, succeeding both as a piece of pure entertainment and as a heartfelt tribute, was frequently cited as the film's central accomplishment by critics writing at the time. Specific praise tended to cluster around a few consistent areas: James Wan's direction, particularly his ability to transition from a horror filmmaking background into large-scale action set pieces without any noticeable growing pains; the performances of the ensemble cast, particularly Vin Diesel's central performance as Dominic Toretto, which many critics noted carried an additional layer of gravity and sincerity given the real circumstances surrounding the production. Jason Statham's introduction as Deckard Shaw, which added a compelling new dynamic to the franchise's villain roster, as discussed in earlier analysis, and, almost universally, the film's handling of its farewell to Brian O'Connor, which was repeatedly singled out as one of the most emotionally effective sequences in any recent blockbuster film. Critical reservations, where they existed, tended to focus on more structural or narrative concerns rather than fundamental objections to the film's quality. Some reviewers noted that the film's plot, involving a hacking device called the God's Eye and a somewhat convoluted series of international objectives, functioned largely as a loose framework for connecting action set pieces rather than as a genuinely compelling narrative in its own right. This is a fair critical observation and one that applies, to varying degrees, across much of the franchise's more recent installments, where plot mechanics have increasingly taken a backseat to spectacle and character dynamics. Other critics raised the point discussed earlier regarding the film's escalating action sequences, questioning whether the increasingly outlandish stunts, however impressively executed, were beginning to strain the franchise's already generous suspension of disbelief. It's worth noting, in the interest of clearly distinguishing fact from interpretation, that critical consensus regarding Furious 7 has remained relatively stable in the years since its release, with the film continuing to be regarded favorably within discussions of the franchise's overall quality, frequently cited alongside Fast 5 as one of the series' strongest installments. This is a matter of aggregated critical and audience opinion rather than a definitive, objective ranking, and individual viewers reasonably differ on how they weigh the film's emotional impact against its narrative or structural shortcomings, awards recognition and cultural staying power. Beyond traditional box office and critical review metrics, Furious 7 also received notable recognition through award nominations and wins, particularly related to its widely celebrated theme song. See You Again, by Wiz Khalifa featuring Charlie Puth received a nomination for the Golden Globe Award for Best Original Song, and while it did not win an Academy Award, given it wasn't submitted in that particular award cycle's qualifying window in the same category as some competitors, the song became one of the most commercially successful and culturally pervasive movie-themed songs of the decade, a rare instance of a franchise action film's musical accompaniment achieving a level of independent cultural relevance that extended well beyond typical film soundtrack recognition. The film's box office records and critical reception, taken together, tell a broader story about how audiences and the film industry process collective grief through commercial entertainment. Furious 7 stands as a genuinely unusual case study, a film that succeeded not despite the tragic circumstances surrounding its production, but partly through its ability to transform that tragedy into something audiences could engage with meaningfully, resulting in numbers and reviews that reflect not just the quality of the filmmaking itself, but the depth of the emotional connection audiences had built with these characters, and with Paul Walker specifically, across more than a decade of franchise history. While much of the conversation around Furious 7 understandably centers on Paul Walker's farewell, Deckard Shaw's introduction, and the film's record-breaking spectacle, one of the most significant and underexplored aspects of the film is how it manages its enormous ensemble cast. By the time Furious 7 was released, the franchise had accumulated one of the largest and most beloved rosters of recurring characters in modern action cinema, and understanding how the film balances these numerous personalities, gives each of them meaningful material, and uses their dynamics to reinforce the franchise's central themes reveals a level of craftsmanship that often gets overshadowed by discussions of the film's more headline-grabbing elements. The challenge of ensemble balance in a franchise this large. By 2015, the core Fast and Furious cast included Vin Diesel as Dominic Toretto, Paul Walker as Brian O'Connor, Michelle Rodriguez as Letty Ortiz, Jordana Brewster as Mia Toretto, Tyrese Gibson as Roman Pierce, Ludacris as Tej Parker, and Dwayne Johnson as Luke Hobbs, alongside newer additions like Natalie Emmanuel as Ramsey, a character introduced in this film as a hacker whose skills become central to the plot. This is an extraordinarily large group of characters to service within a single 2-hour-plus runtime, especially when the film also needs to introduce Jason Statham's Deckard Shaw, Djimon Hounsou's Jakand, and Kurt Russell's Mr. Nobody, a mysterious government operative who becomes an important recurring figure in the franchise from this point forward. Balancing an ensemble this large is one of the more difficult tasks in blockbuster screenwriting, and it's worth examining how Chris Morgan's script and James Wan's direction approach this challenge. Rather than attempting to give every character an equally weighted individual arc, which would almost certainly result in a bloated, unfocused film, Furious 7 instead organizes its ensemble around a hub-and-spoke structure, with Dominic Toretto functioning as the emotional and narrative center, while other characters are paired off or grouped into smaller functional units that allow the film to service multiple relationships without needing to individually spotlight every single character in isolation. Roman and Tej, for instance, are consistently paired together throughout the film, functioning as a comedic duo whose banter provides levity between the more intense dramatic and action-driven sequences. This pairing is not a new invention specific to this film, it's a dynamic the franchise had established across several previous installments, but Furious 7 uses it particularly effectively as a release valve, allowing the film to shift tonal registers without whiplash, moving from the heavier emotional material surrounding Brian's storyline or the tension of Shaw's attacks into lighter, more comedic beats without those transitions feeling jarring or inconsistent. Letty's amnesia storyline and its function within the larger narrative. One storyline worth analyzing in particular depth is Letty Ortiz's ongoing amnesia arc, which had been introduced in Fast and Furious 6 following Letty's dramatic return after having been presumed dead earlier in the franchise's timeline. In Furious 7, this amnesia storyline continues, with Letty struggling to reconcile fragmented memories of her past relationship with Dom against her present reality of not fully remembering the life and the marriage they shared before her apparent death. This is a narratively bold choice for the franchise, since it essentially forces two characters with a long, established romantic history to interact as near strangers, creating an unusual dynamic where the audience possesses far more knowledge about the relationship's history than Letty's character does within the story itself. From a character analysis perspective, this storyline serves several important functions. First, it gives Michelle Rodriguez substantial dramatic material to work with beyond simply being reintegrated into the ensemble as though nothing had changed, allowing her performance to explore themes of identity, self-discovery, and the tension between who a person once was and who they are choosing to become in the present. Second, it creates a compelling emotional through line that runs parallel to, and thematically echoes, the film's larger meditation on family, memory, and loss, given the real-world context surrounding Paul Walker's death discussed extensively in earlier sections. Letty's struggle to reclaim her memories and her sense of belonging within Dom's found family mirrors, in a fictional register, the broader themes of legacy and remembrance that permeate the entire film. Third, this storyline sets up a satisfying, if relatively low-key, resolution by the film's end, as Letty gradually begins reconnecting with fragments of her former life, providing one of several smaller emotional payoffs that contribute to the film's overall sense of closure and reconciliation. It's worth noting, from a critical perspective, that some reviewers found this storyline somewhat underdeveloped within the context of this particular film, given how much other narrative material Furious 7 needed to juggle. This is a fair observation. Letty's arc receives meaningful but not extensive screen time, and viewers looking for a fully resolved, deeply explored version of this storyline within Furious 7 alone may find it somewhat truncated. However, understanding this arc as part of a longer, multi-film continuation, one that would eventually pay off more fully in subsequent installments, provides useful context for why the film treats it with a lighter touch here, prioritizing incremental progress over complete resolution. Luke Hobbs and the introduction of a new kind of franchise power player. Dwayne Johnson's Luke Hobbs, introduced in Fast 5 as a relentless federal agent pursuing Dom's crew before eventually becoming an ally, occupies an interesting position within Furious 7's ensemble. Structurally, Hobbs functions somewhat separately from the core Toretto family unit for much of the film, operating through his own government agency rather than embedded directly within Dom's crew. This separation is narratively useful because it allows the film to expand its scope beyond the immediate family dynamic, situating the story within a larger world of international espionage and government operations that the franchise had been gradually building since Fast 5 and Fast and Furious 6. Hobbs's early confrontation with Deckard Shaw, discussed in the previous section on the film's villain, serves a crucial narrative function beyond simply delivering an impressive fight sequence. It establishes Shaw's threat level definitively before he ever crosses paths with the core cast, since Hobbs, up to this point in the franchise, had been portrayed as an almost unstoppable physical force. Watching Shaw not only fight Hobbs to a standstill but ultimately incapacitate him significantly raises the stakes for the audience, signaling that this villain operates on a fundamentally different level than previous antagonists. Dwayne Johnson's limited screen time in the film's middle act, a consequence of Hobbs being seriously injured following this confrontation, is a deliberate structural choice, though it's worth noting as an interesting piece of behind-the-scenes context that Johnson's reduced involvement in this particular film was reportedly also influenced by scheduling considerations and his simultaneous commitments to other major projects during this period. Johnson's eventual return in the film's climax, arriving in dramatic fashion to assist in the Los Angeles finale, delivers a satisfying payoff that rewards patient viewers and reinforces the franchise's recurring theme of family showing up for each other when it matters most. Kurt Russell's Mr. Nobody, expanding the franchise's mythology. Kurt Russell's introduction as the enigmatic government operative Mr. Nobody represents an interesting creative choice worth examining in its own right. Russell, a veteran actor with decades of experience in genre filmmaking, brings a laid-back, wry charisma to a character who essentially functions as the franchise's connective tissue to larger geopolitical stakes and shadowy government operations. Mr. Nobody's presence in Furious 7 signals the franchise's continued evolution away from its street racing origins toward something closer to an international espionage thriller, a trajectory that would become even more pronounced in subsequent films. From a casting analysis perspective, bringing in an actor of Kurt Russell's stature and recognizable screen presence for what is technically a supporting role reflects the franchise's growing confidence and resources by this point in its life cycle. It's a signal to audiences that the series was no longer just a collection of talented action performers, but had become the kind of successful, prestigious franchise capable of attracting veteran, well-respected actors for even secondary roles. Russell's performance also introduces a specific tonal register, a kind of knowing, slightly amused authority, that provides a useful counterbalance to the film's more emotionally weighted or intensely dramatic sequences, giving the film another tool for modulating its overall tone across a lengthy runtime covering a wide range of emotional and narrative registers. Ramsey's introduction and the franchise's evolving approach to new characters. Nathalie Emmanuel's introduction as Ramsey, a brilliant hacker whose God's Eye surveillance program becomes the film's central MacGuffin, is worth examining as a case study in how the franchise integrates new characters into its established family dynamic. Ramsey begins the film as an outsider, a civilian caught in the middle of a dangerous international conflict entirely unrelated to her original life, and her gradual integration into Dom's crew over the course of the film mirrors a pattern the franchise has used repeatedly with previous newcomers. This pattern, in which initially reluctant or unaffiliated characters are drawn into the found family through shared danger and mutual reliance, reinforces one of the series' most consistent thematic through lines. That family, in this fictional universe, is fundamentally a matter of choice and earned trust rather than pure circumstance or blood relation. Ramsey's character also serves an important practical narrative function, providing the technical expertise necessary to explain and operate the God's Eye technology that drives much of the film's plot. This kind of expository, skill-based character is a common device in heist and espionage-adjacent storytelling, giving the ensemble a member whose specific competency justifies certain plot developments and action sequences. What's notable about how the film handles Ramsey specifically is that, despite her plot-functional role, she's given enough characterization and screen presence to feel like a genuine addition to the ensemble rather than a purely mechanical plot device, setting up her continued presence in subsequent franchise installments. The overall significance of ensemble craftsmanship in Furious 7. Taken together, the way Furious 7 manages its enormous ensemble cast represents a genuine achievement in blockbuster screenwriting and directing, even if this aspect of the film often receives less attention than its more headline-grabbing elements. The film successfully juggles multiple character arcs, from Letty's ongoing struggle with her fragmented memory, to Hobbs's temporary sidelining and triumphant return, to the introduction of new figures like Mr. Nobody and Ramsey, all while maintaining Dominic Toretto and Brian O'Connor's central emotional arc as the film's true focus. This balancing act is essential to understanding why Furious 7 works as effectively as it does, because a film this heavily focused on spectacle and emotional tribute still needs a functioning ensemble of characters that audiences care about and believe in order for either the action or the emotional beats to land with real impact. This ensemble management also reflects a broader industry lesson that other long-running franchises have often struggled to replicate. The Fast and Furious series, by this point, had cultivated such a deep well of audience goodwill toward its extended cast of characters that even relatively brief, efficiently handled character beats could carry significant emotional weight, simply because audiences had spent years, in some cases well over a decade, building relationships with these fictional personalities. This is a testament to the consistency of casting and character writing across the franchise's history, a foundation that Furious 7 draws upon extensively, allowing it to deliver a film with genuine emotional richness across its many characters despite the practical constraints of runtime and the need to service an unusually large and demanding narrative agenda. And Mr. Nobody is ambushed. In a brutal attack on a desert highway, Jacan's team, using a stealth helicopter and a drone missile, attacks Mr. Nobody's convoy. Mr. Nobody is gravely wounded. Dom saves him, but Mr. Nobody has to disappear. Before he goes, he tells Dom, "Save Letty." and don't let God's eye fall. Jacan now has Ramsey and God's eye is in play. 5. Los Angeles, all roads collide. Back in Los Angeles, the team goes to Brian's house. Mia and Jack are there, along with Letty, Tej, and Roman. This is the emotional heart of the film. Brian is torn between two lives, the dangerous, adrenaline-fueled life with Dom, and the safe life as a father and husband. Mia tells him, "You need to stop pretending you're not who you are. But when this is over, we need to be done." Dom makes a plan. They will use God's eye to lure Shaw and Jacan into a trap in Los Angeles, where Hobbs can back them up. Ramsey explains, God's eye needs to get close to its target to maintain tracking. They set up a base in a factory. Ramsey sets the program to find Shaw. Shaw, true to his word, comes alone. He confronts Dom in a parking garage. The two have a final, brutal street fight while cars are being smashed around them. It's Vin Diesel versus Jason Statham with tire irons and pure rage. Simultaneously, Jacan arrives with his entire militia, a helicopter, and a Predator drone. He wants God's eye and he doesn't care who dies. He starts blowing up the city. Hobbs, despite being in a hospital sling, sees the chaos on TV and leaves the hospital, breaking his own arm cast off in the process, and joins the fight in an ambulance. Tej, Roman, Letty, and Ramsey fight off mercenaries. Brian is tasked with resetting God's eye and shutting down Jacan's helicopter's hacking signal from the top of a parking garage. Then it all converges on the streets of downtown LA. Jacan's helicopter is firing missiles. Hobbs drives a car and pulls the Predator drone down. Dom chases Jacan's helicopter in his Dodge Charger. He drives through rubble, launches his car off a parking garage, and latches onto the helicopter with a bag of grenades. Deckard Shaw, who was about to kill Dom, is intercepted by Hobbs. Hobbs versus Shaw, two massive men, have a showdown where Hobbs literally says, "You better hide that big forehead," and then knocks Shaw out by flexing through concrete and finishing him with a torpedo on a car roof. Dom pulls the grenades, drops from the helicopter at the last second, and Hobbs shoots the bag, blowing up Jacan and his helicopter. The day is saved. God's eye is recovered. Mr. Nobody returns, takes God's eye and Shaw into custody. Shaw is locked in a CIA black site. He promises Dom that the record on Brian and Dom is cleared, that they are now free. 6. The goodbye. The film ends not with a race, but with a quiet moment. The crew is on a beach, having a barbecue, the Toretto family tradition. Brian and Mia are playing with Jack. They are at peace. Dom looks at Brian and acknowledges that Brian has finally found what Dom always wanted, a real family outside the chaos. Letty finally remembers everything. She remembers her wedding with Dom, her vows. Dom and Letty finally reconnect fully. Brian and Mia decide to retire. For good this time. The final scene, Dom and Brian drive side by side one last time on a winding canyon road in their white Toyota and Dodge. It's a callback to the very first film. Dom narrates in a voiceover. "I used to say I live my life a quarter mile at a time. And I think that's why we were brothers, because you did too. No matter where you are, whether it's a quarter mile away or halfway across the world, you'll always be with me. And you'll always be my brother." Brian's car takes an exit. Dom's goes straight. The white car disappears. The screen fades to white. This ending was rewritten after Paul Walker's tragic death in a car accident in November 2013, during filming. The film had to stop production for months. His brothers Caleb and Cody Walker stood in as body doubles, and Weta Digital used CGI to recreate Paul's face. The song that plays, "See You Again," by Wiz Khalifa and Charlie Puth, became a global tribute to him. That final 5 minutes isn't acting. It's the cast saying goodbye to their real friend. That's why Furious 7 made over $1.5 billion and is remembered as the most emotional film in the franchise. The plot about God's eye and Shaw is exciting, but the real story is about how far family will go to protect each other, and how hard it is to let go when it's time to drive a different road. And Mr. Nobody is ambushed. In a brutal attack on a desert highway, Jacan's team, using a stealth helicopter and a drone missile, attacks Mr. Nobody's convoy. Mr. Nobody is gravely wounded. Dom saves him, but Mr. Nobody has to disappear. Before he goes, he tells Dom, "Save Letty. And don't let God's eye fall." Jacan now has Ramsey and God's eye is in play. 5. Los Angeles, all roads collide. Back in Los Angeles, the team goes to Brian's house. Mia and Jack are there, along with Letty, Tej, and Roman. This is the emotional heart of the film. Brian is torn between two lives, the dangerous, adrenaline-fueled life with Dom, and the safe life as a father and husband. Mia tells him, "You need to stop pretending you're not who you are. But when this is over, we need to be done." Dom makes a plan. They will use God's eye to lure Shaw and Jacan into a trap in Los Angeles, where Hobbs can back them up. Ramsey explains, God's eye needs to get close to its target to maintain tracking. They set up a base in a factory. Ramsey sets the program to find Shaw. Shaw, true to his word, comes alone. He confronts Dom in a parking garage. The two have a final, brutal street fight while cars are being smashed around them. It's Vin Diesel versus Jason Statham with tire irons and pure rage. Simultaneously, Jacand arrives with his entire militia, a helicopter, and a Predator drone. He wants God's eye and he doesn't care who dies. He starts blowing up the city. Hobbs, despite being in a hospital sling, sees the chaos on TV and leaves the hospital, breaking his own arm cast off in the process, and joins the fight in an ambulance. Tej, Roman, Letty, and Ramsey fight off mercenaries. Brian is tasked with resetting God's eye and shutting down Jacand's helicopter's hacking signal from the top of a parking garage. Then it all converges on the streets of downtown LA. Jacand's helicopter is firing missiles. Hobbs drives a car and pulls the Predator drone down. Dom chases Jacand's helicopter in his Dodge Charger. He drives through rubble, launches his car off a parking garage, and latches onto the helicopter with a bag of grenades. Deckard Shaw, who was about to kill Dom, is intercepted by Hobbs. Hobbs versus Shaw, two massive men, have a showdown where Hobbs literally says, "You better hide that big forehead," and then knocks Shaw out by flexing through concrete and finishing him with a torpedo on a car roof. Dom pulls the grenades, drops from the helicopter at the last second, and Hobbs shoots the bag, blowing up Jacand and his helicopter. The day is saved. God's eye is recovered. Mr. Nobody returns, takes God's eye and Shaw into custody. Shaw is locked in a CIA black site. He promises Dom that the record on Brian and Dom is cleared, that they are now free. 6. The Goodbye. The film ends not with a race, but with a quiet moment. The crew is on a beach, having a barbecue, the Toretto family tradition. Brian and Mia are playing with Jack. They are at peace. Dom looks at Brian and acknowledges that Brian has finally found what Dom always wanted, a real family outside the chaos. Letty finally remembers everything. She remembers her wedding with Dom, her vows. Dom and Letty finally reconnect fully. Brian and Mia decide to retire. For good this time. The final scene, Dom and Brian drive side by side one last time on a winding canyon road in their white Toyota and Dodge. It's a callback to the very first film. Dom narrates in a voiceover. "I used to say I live my life a quarter mile at a time. And I think that's why we were brothers, because you did too. No matter where you are, whether it's a quarter mile away or halfway across the world, you'll always be with me. And you'll always be my brother." Brian's car takes an exit. Dom's goes straight. The white car disappears. The screen fades to white. This ending was rewritten after Paul Walker's tragic death in a car accident in November 2013, during filming. The film had to stop production for months. His brothers Caleb and Cody Walker stood in as body doubles, and Weta Digital used CGI to recreate Paul's face. The song that plays, "See You Again," by Wiz Khalifa and Charlie Puth, became a global tribute to him. That final 5 minutes isn't acting. It's the cast saying goodbye to their real friend. That's why Furious 7 made over $1.5 billion and is remembered as the most emotional film in the franchise. The plot about God's eye and Shaw is exciting, but the real story is about how far family will go to protect each other, and how hard it is to let go when it's time to drive a different road.